Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Beyond the Gates is hinting at an extremely dangerous direction, as Lynette's arrival may be the very key that unlocks the past Hayley buried so long ago. If Hayley's secrets are truly exposed in full, the reaction from the people around her will not stop at shock, disappointment, or outrage. It could trigger a chain of destruction strong enough to shake all of Fairmont Crest. Everything I create is purely speculation and personal opinion. If you find this video interesting and helpful, please support me with a like and leave a comment. In Fairmont Crest, not every storm begins with the sound of shattering glass or gunfire. Some storms arrive with something much smaller, almost ordinary from a distance, like the sound of heels stopping in a hallway, like a door left half closed. Like a sentence pressed down until it becomes nothing more than a poisonous breath slipping out between two women who appear to be keeping their composure. But it is often those tiny sounds that signal a life is about to be torn apart. And this time, the center of that earthquake is not Bill, nor a loud lawsuit, nor one of the social scandals Fairmont Crest is so used to dissecting over elegant dinners. This time, it lies in the fear written plainly across Hayley's face, in the deadened stare of Tomas after the moment he accidentally overheard something that was never meant for his ears. And in the presence of Lynette, the woman who entered the room carrying neither knife nor gun, yet made the air so thick with threat that it felt as if one more lowering of her voice could make someone's entire life collapse on the spot. What Tomas heard at first did not sound like a complete confession. It was fragmented, incomplete, lacking enough beginning and end for anyone to instantly piece together the full picture. But some fragments do not need to be many to terrify. Just a few words, the right tone, the right name spoken with an unnatural coldness, were enough to set every instinct in Tomas on alert. He did not just hear Lynette threaten to destroy Hayley. What chilled him more was the way Lynette referred to a mistake from the past as if it had not been an accident, not a shameful moment of weakness, but a deliberate act buried under money, power, and silence. The most horrifying thing was not that Hayley had once done something wrong. In Fairmont Crest, everyone has at least one secret capable of ruining everything if dragged into the light. What left Tomas frozen was the way Lynette spoke of that secret in the voice of someone holding undeniable proof, as though she did not need to guess, did not need to interrogate, did not need to bluff. She knew far too much. And Hayley, who usually carried herself with icy control, who always knew how to build a nearly flawless shell of composure, stood there almost paralyzed, offering no resistance, no denial. No angry protest like someone falsely accused. Her silence was more frightening than any confession because it showed Tomas that he might have misjudged this woman from the very beginning. That moment did not simply shatter the image Tomas had of Hayley. It forced him to face an even more unsettling possibility. Perhaps Hayley was not the only victim in this story, but she was not innocent either. Tomas had always seen Hayley as a woman swept into power currents far beyond her ability to resist, someone sometimes calculating, sometimes selfish, but still holding onto some moral line not yet completely erased. Yet when he heard Lynette coldly mention that night what was cleaned up and the price Hayley let someone else pay in her place, a very real dread began to crawl through him. He was no longer sure the secret was only a romantic scandal, an act of betrayal, or a manipulated legal file. It could be something far crueler. It could have been an accident turned into another story. It could have been someone who lost everything in exchange for Hayley's silence. It could have been a forged signature. It could have been a name pushed forward as a scapegoat. Fairmont Crest has never lacked sins wrapped in silk and expensive perfume. But what made Tomas shudder was the sense that Hayley had already crossed that line long ago. And he had simply failed to see it. Not because she was too clever, but because he had wanted to believe that beneath her defenses and schemes there was still something worth protecting. That realization was what made him angry at himself. He was not only afraid of what he had heard. He was afraid of how naive his own heart had once been, willing to take the side of someone who now might stand at the center of a dark and terrible secret. For Hayley, her fear of Lynette was not just the fear of a woman who knew an old story. It ran deeper than that, dirtier than that, more humiliating than that. It was not merely the fear of being publicly exposed. It was the fear of being forced to look at herself, to face the worst version of who she had been, the version she had spent her whole life burying beneath perfect makeup, carefully calculated choices, and the image of a woman merely trying to survive in a cruel world. Lynette did not hold a rumor. Lynette held real memory, perhaps more than memory. Perhaps a recording, transaction records, a photograph, emails, or a witness Hayley had once assumed was gone forever. Whatever it was enough to make Hayley understand that resisting now would only kill her faster. The saddest part was not that she feared losing her reputation. She feared Tomas learning the truth and looking at her with contempt. In Hayley's world, being hated was easier than being seen clearly. Being called calculating, selfish, ambitious was easier than having someone recognize that deep down, in panic or ambition or cowardice, she had once made a decision capable of destroying another person's life. That is why the moment she sensed something wrong behind her, the moment she feared Tomas might have heard part of her confrontation with Lynette, her terror went beyond exposure. It became primal panic. She was not only afraid Tomas would speak. She was afraid he would understand who she really was. Lynette, meanwhile, was the most dangerous kind of player in any Fairmont Crest scheme, the kind who does not act only for money, nor only for revenge, but for the pleasure of control. If she had only wanted to destroy Hayley, she could have released the evidence long ago. If she had only wanted to exploit her, she could have demanded money and disappeared, but Lynette did neither. She appeared at the exact moment Hayley had begun to believe the past was fully buried. She tightened her grip little by little, enough to suffocate Hayley without killing her, enough to force her to live each day with the feeling of collapse hanging inches away. This was no longer ordinary blackmail. It was psychological torture fed by something intensely personal. Perhaps Lynette had once been betrayed by Hayley. Perhaps she had been the one who cleaned up the wreckage for her and was then abandoned. Perhaps she knew that the most painful thing was not to drag the secret into the light immediately, but to force Hayley to kneel before her own fear. To make her choose worse and worse actions in order to keep that secret buried. Someone like Lynette does not only want to win. She wants Hayley to corrupt herself in order to survive. She wants Hayley to become living proof of her own old guilt. And if Lynette knew Tomas had overheard part of the truth, then Tomas would no longer be a bystander. He would become the most dangerous variable of all because he belonged to no one side, was not trapped the way Hayley was, and had not sunk so deeply that he could no longer tell right from wrong. To people who rule through secrets, a witness can be more dangerous than an open enemy because a witness can bring light. After that night, Tomas found himself trapped between two opposing instincts. One part of him wanted to go straight to Hayley, force her to tell the truth, rip away that mask immediately so he could at least know what ground he was standing on. But the other part, colder and more cautious, understood that direct confrontation would only make Hayley shut every door. If she was truly as afraid as he had just seen, if Lynette really held something capable of destroying her entire life, then Hayley would not confess. She would lie, explain, distort, redirect, or worse, do whatever was necessary to protect herself. Tomas began revisiting every small detail he had once ignored. Hayley's strange unease whenever Lynette's file was mentioned. The way she dodged questions that had once seemed harmless. The way Bill sometimes looked at this situation not as a legal problem to solve, but as trash that simply needed to disappear. The way leads connected to Lynette would suddenly appear and then be cut off again, as if someone kept clearing the path behind the scenes. Each piece on its own felt fragile. Together they formed a picture that made Tomas colder the deeper he dug. And the colder he became, the angrier he grew. Angry at Lynette for a cruelty sharpened like a blade. Angry at Hayley for hiding so much for so long. But most of all, angry at the feeling that he was being dragged into a war in which no one was truly innocent. The tension grew when Hayley began to realize Tomas no longer looked at her the same way. It was the kind of change so small that outsiders might miss it, but painfully obvious to someone already living in panic. Tomas asked shorter questions, stared longer, stayed silent in moments when he would once have comforted her. For someone desperately trying to keep her life from collapsing, those changes were more frightening than any accusation. Hayley began to feel cornered. If Tomas had heard, what was she supposed to do? Beg him to keep quiet? That would be almost the same as confessing. Lie. The past between her and Lynette was no longer something that could be patched over with a believable story. Blame Lynette. That might be partly true, but it would never be enough if Tomas had heard the guilty silence hanging over her. The worst part was realizing she was not only afraid of losing what she had. She was afraid of being forced, for the first time, to choose between two paths that both ended at the edge of a cliff. Keep obeying Lynette. Sink deeper into this old filth to maintain a false kind of survival, or strike back and accept that once the secret exploded, the first person crushed might be herself. That conflict wore Hayley down hour by hour. She lost sleep, lost patience, grew sharper and more volatile with anyone who touched a nerve. But beneath that aggression was a person genuinely breaking apart. She no longer knew whether she feared Lynette or feared the inevitable moment when Tomas would stop seeing her as someone worth saving. Lynette, by contrast, seemed to sense those fractures and enjoy them. She did not need to appear constantly. A few perfectly timed messages, a few cold reminders, a few details proving she was still watching were enough to leave Hayley gasping for air. She began demanding more, not only material things, but submission. Sometimes she forced Hayley to interfere in a legal decision. Sometimes she made her pass along information, delay a file, or redirect suspicion towards someone else. And that was the point where Tomas, quietly tracing the truth, felt a second wave of horror. The dark secret from years ago was not just a corpse buried in the past. It was living again, reproducing itself in new actions. Hayley was not only being threatened over something old. She was being turned into a tool for present schemes. But what made it worse was that she was not entirely forced. After weak moments of resistance, Hayley still chose to comply. Not because she had been fully complicit from the beginning, but because her fear of protecting herself was winning. And that was when Tomas had to face the cruelest question of all. If someone once did wrong out of desperation, then keeps doing wrong to cover the first wrong, at what point do they stop being a victim and become a perpetrator? There was no comforting answer, and that lack of comfort turned Tomas's quiet investigation into a journey that eroded his soul, not just a search for truth. The deeper Tomas went, the more he saw a network that did not revolve around one personal secret alone. Behind Hayley and Lynette there may have been an entire chain of old compromises among money, silence, and privilege. Something that once looked like the desperate mistake of a frightened woman may have been covered up by many hands working together. The powerful cleared the road. The weaker were pushed out to take the fall. Someone lost a name, a career, perhaps even a life, all so that a cleaner version of the truth could be allowed to survive. Once Tomas grasped the scale of what he was touching, he understood this was no longer a story he could solve through honesty or compassion alone. If he kept going, he might save Hayley from Lynette, but he might also expose that Hayley herself had once been saved by burying someone else under the rubble. And if he stepped back, he would be allowing Lynette to keep tightening the chain around her until nothing human remained. That deadlock pushed Tomas into his most violent state of mind yet. He despised the weakness that had made Hayley a hostage to her own past, yet could not completely turn away from her very real fear. He was angry at her for not speaking, but also understood that some secrets are so filthy that the person carrying them would rather be strangled than confess them out loud. He was no longer standing outside as an observer. He had been dragged into the center of a minefield where every step forward could blow apart yet another life. Then came the point when Hayley realized she could not keep standing in the middle any longer. Lynette was tightening her grip. Tomas was growing colder by the day. The last masks were no longer enough to hide the cracks. In her panic, a very dark part of Hayley began to wake up. It was the part that had once helped her survive when the past nearly crushed her. The part that believed morality was a luxury reserved for people who had never been pushed to the edge. The part willing to be ruthless if ruthlessness was the only way to avoid losing everything. This was Hayley's most dangerous moment because a desperate person does not always confess, but may do something far worse in order to delay collapse. She might go to Tomas with cares, half-truths, and a carefully polished version of events designed to make her look more like a victim than a culprit. She might try to shift all suspicion toward Lynette. She might quietly destroy what remained of the evidence, or worse, help silence someone else all over again. The tragedy is that deep down, Hayley still carries a small hope of being saved in a cleaner way. She wants someone to pull her out without forcing her to stare directly at the wreckage she helped create. But reality offers her no such gentle path. To truly survive, she must choose between pain and destruction. And so the conflict among Hayley, Lynette, and Tomas is no longer an ordinary cat-and-mouse game. It has become a clash among three different kinds of fear. Lynette fears losing control, so she tightens her grip harder. Hayley fears being seen for who she really is, so she sinks deeper into lies. Tomas fears the truth arriving too late, when everything has already become so stained that no one can be fully saved anymore. What makes this story suffocating is not only the question of what Hayley did in the past, but the way that secret continues poisoning the present, forcing each of them to reveal their truest face once cornered. What did Tomas hear that horrified him so deeply? Perhaps not just a threat. He heard the sound of someone who once buried her conscience in order to go on living. He heard the truth that Hayley may have let someone else bear the consequences in her place. He heard the way Lynette used that memory as a chain around her throat. And worst of all, he heard in Hayley's silence the confirmation that not every fear is innocent. From here, no one can return to who they once were. If Tomas chooses to keep digging, he may break apart an entire system of silence, but he will also become the one who ignites Hayley's downfall. If Hayley chooses to confess, she may finally sever Lynette's grip, but the price will be the loss of her reputation, her power, and the last fragile piece of trust Tomas still has in her. If she strikes back, Fairmont Crest will witness a quiet but ruthless purge where evidence disappears, witnesses change their stories. And those who thought they were safely outside the storm suddenly realize they have become pawns. And Lynette, if cornered in return, will not hesitate to drag everyone down with her. That is what makes the air around these three more dangerous than any glamorous scandal before it. None of them are fighting just to win anymore. They are fighting not to be erased. And in that kind of battle, the final line between self-defense and cruelty is usually the first thing to disappear. In Fairmont Crest, people like to say that secrets buried deeply enough eventually become the past. But this time, the past did not die. It rose, walked back into the room wearing Lynette's face, hiding in the tremor inside Hayley's chest, and in the shattered look in Tomas's eyes. And once the truth has begun to breathe again, it will not stop at threatening. It will demand blood, demand reputation, demand one betrayal after another, until one of the three is forced to do the most desperate thing of all just to survive.